All right. Hi, I'm Jesse Chan. I'm an assistant professor of accounting at Questrom. And I want to talk today about how financial markets consume and integrate ESG metrics. So we're all interested in how do we report on these topics? And a lot of my research studies how markets consume and process these disclosures. So before I talk about it, I like to think about the state of the world of where do these metrics come from? That helps me to think about how people consume these metrics. So firms have all sorts of ESG related activities and operations. So firms have carbon emissions, they have operational exposure to climate related risks. And just as an example, not inclusive, they have policies and procedures on how they think about workplace diversity and where they'd like to see themselves in terms of their workforce. So there's all these underlying activities that firms are doing related to ESG related issues. And so they want to tell the world about these things, right? So firms want to tell investors, consumers, stakeholders, governments, and so they produce these, as of current, largely voluntary disclosures about what they're working on, what their emissions are, and they do this through a wide variety of places. And this leads to this additional industry of people that will help you as an investor sift through all of these different metrics. So there's various ratings from ratings agencies, there's dedicated ESG reporting analysts, and there's various aggregators out there, some of which we use for academic research. And this leads to this broader ESG information environment. So there's all this information that's out there, and as investors, as governments, as stakeholders, we go to this environment and consume this information, right? And we use it to make decisions. And a lot of my research collectively, instead of talking about one specific study, I'll talk about how my studies like collectively answer this question. A lot of my studies focus on, okay, so what are we doing? What's going on in this information environment, and how are people responding to this? So what are we learning? So I worked on a few different projects that look at how various stakeholders consume this data, including equity research analysts and investors. And there's this interesting tension of how ESG related disclosures and information affects how investors and other stakeholders interpret financial disclosures as well. So we're seeing that there's some evidence that investors find management's financial disclosures less credible when they have a bad ESG event, for example. And related to that, if we think about that map, I kind of move one step back in the chain from how people consume this information to how firms produce this information. I have a couple projects I'm working on that look at how firms communicate their ESG related events to markets. So one studying how firms use pictures to manage investors' perceptions, and one studying how utilities disclose their tax credit usage and how that foreshadows their future reporting. And finally, some of my research more broadly studies how market participants are affected by ESG behavior, including how social movements affect B2B relationships in the auditor-client setting, how auditors' behavior is affected by their clients' employee satisfaction, so how the corporate culture at their clients affects their own behavior, and also how gender diversity issues in the workplace help shape the composition of people who consume information professionally. So how information intermediaries are affected by diversity issues. So as part of this thinking, there's all these open areas to explore in ESG metrics. And so I wanted to highlight a few things that in accounting that we're thinking about over the next few years as this environment becomes richer and matures out a little bit. So we're seeing a convergence in standardization of reporting. So there is some emerging reporting standards that'll help us kind of narrow the divergence in reporting that we see out there. And so what's interesting is to think about how will this affect the current information environment, right? So these rules are going to shape what's out there, and this is such a new and emerging area that it'll be interesting to see how these changes shape behavior. There's also increased use of advanced technologies in ESG reporting. And so how will these new technologies help both the firms that produce and communicate their information, and also how as investors we consume this information. And so it'll be interesting to see how that shapes this behavior as well, if we think about all the different things that affect that third box in that slide from 2 slides ago. And finally, there is increased divergence or emerging divergence in how people view ESG and its importance in investing. And so I think we're all interested, and we think it's extremely important, but there's starting to be some backlash to this in some corners of the investing community as well. And so something that we're thinking about in accounting research is how this divergence in beliefs is going to shape financial markets. And so with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks.